Welcome to Theoria TV audiobooks. We will jump into this title in just a minute. But first, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you appreciate our efforts to bring Orthodox books to you in audio form free of charge, please consider supporting the channel by joining as a member here on YouTube or via Patreon, which is linked in the description. Thanks and enjoy your book.
On Gender and the Soul, an exploration of sex/gender and its relation to the soul according to the Church Fathers, by Benjamin Cabe, published by Theoria TV. Chapter 5. The Orthodox Church and Modern Gender Theory. There is an infinite gap between creation and the God who created it, for God alone is uncreated. God alone is without beginning. Within creation itself, which God created out of nothing, there also exists a gap between the intelligible creation and the sensible creation. One is incorporeal, intelligent, and rational, and to it belongs free will. The other is corporeal and dense, made up of the material elements and encompassed by three dimensions. Angels, which have an intelligible essence, belong to the first. The cosmos and animals to the second, because they have a sensible essence. But the human being is unique among God's creation. Made up of soul and body together, not one without the other, he bridges the gap between the intelligible creation and the sensible creation. He is a microcosm. To the human being alone belongs both the intelligible and sensible essences, which together comprise the singular human nature, existing without differentiation in both men and women. Human nature itself is made up of a sensible, material essence, the human body, and an intelligible essence, the human soul. That which is of a sensible essence is complex and composite, liable to differentiation of parts without differentiation of essence. Intelligible essences are simple and incomposite. For this reason, any differentiation in them, whether by addition or subtraction of energies or powers, for these are the only parts we can speak about in the soul, necessarily divides them by essence. Concerning the intelligible essences of angels, St. John of Damascus admits we do not know if they differ by essence, but we do know they differ from each other in brightness and position, just as men can differ spiritually by their closeness to God and in the world by their occupation. Thomas Aquinas reasoned that the angels differ in essence, that there are species of angels. While we do know a difference of energies points to a difference of essence, and sameness of energies points to sameness of essence. As Orthodox Christians, we confess, along with St. John, that we do not know enough about angels to be able to say if they differ merely by rank or by essence as well. The sensible essence of the human body. The human body itself is made up of a combination of countless atoms, the building blocks of the material world. While there are many different kinds of flesh, that is, many different species within the material world, there is but one flesh of man. 6. The many variations and parts of the body do not divide its single, sensible essence as a human body. Neither do the biological differences between men and women divide it, for a sensible essence admits division and variation of material parts. This is why the variance between a male and a female in physical structure does not subdivide the human race into two different species. We likewise affirm with the Apostle that there is one kind of flesh that belongs to every human being. Consider the following example. A man born without legs or a child, not yet fully formed in the womb, are both considered human beings consubstantial with the rest of the human race, even though they do not yet, or perhaps never will, possess the physical attributes that normally belong to the human body. For the body, as a sensible essence, admits change and physical growth. The stage at which a person is in this process does not, or rather should not, hinder his classification as a human being. The Orthodox teaching concerning the unborn child specifically is that from the very moment of conception, he is a human being, a unique creation, even though his physical form does not yet look like it, for he possesses at that very moment both a sensible essence, the one flesh of man, in the process of growing to maturity, and an intelligible essence in its entirety. He is formed in the image of God, with the possibility of attaining to the likeness of God. The intelligible essence of the human soul. The human soul is neither material nor composite. It is simple and intelligible in its essence. It is singular, and one in that it is not made up of many parts. While there are many powers or energies of the soul which might be called the parts of the soul, although this expression is somewhat crude, they do not divide its singular, intelligible essence. But the soul cannot be divided into parts as the body can. Neither can it admit a variation of parts as the body does, since it is not a material substance. Any such variation in an intelligible essence necessarily divides it in essence, for any differentiation of parts would be a differentiation of energy. If there are souls with different parts, then they must be admitted to be of different essences. There can be no substantial differences, then, between the souls of men and women. Rather, the soul of every single human being contains the exact same powers and energies. While there may be a variation in how these energies are used from person to person based on ascetic discipline or disposition, each person possesses the same kind of soul, a human soul. Theological consequences of the gendered soul. If the souls of men and women differ from one another substantially, if a male soul is or contains something the female soul is or does not, or vice versa, so that there is a true distinction beyond disposition, then it would follow that there are two different kinds of human souls, one male and one female. This distortion of Orthodox anthropology is one of the ways the belief in the gendered soul damages the theology of those who profess it. This distinction of male and female souls would divide the human race in a way our bodies do not divide it, since it precludes the possibility that there is a human soul. Such a claim requires us to confess that there is a male soul and a female soul. This, in turn, necessarily differentiates one from one another by essence, since they differ from one another by parts or energies. If this were the case, there would not be one human nature, but two, one male and one female. As such, men and women could not be considered consubstantial with one another. As emphasized earlier, one can only properly speak of a human being as soul and body together, not as soul without body or body without soul. For the union of these two exists from conception without confusion or mixture or division or separation, in a manner akin to the mystery of Christ's divinity and humanity. In fact, the structure of the human being, whose nature is made up of an intelligible and a sensible essence, seems to be a kind of typology prefiguring the incarnate Christ. He holds together, in his divine person, two natures completely unlike one another, bridging the gulf, separating humanity from divinity, but not confusing the two. This is the most important reason for professing the sexlessness of the soul. How we understand human nature and whether or not the soul is gendered radically affects how we understand salvation in Christ. The importance of the sexlessness of the soul. The forced separation of the soul and the body in death is not a natural event. Death only exists as a result of sin. But death no longer reigns. The second person of the Holy Trinity, the divine Logos, who himself is uncreated, was incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary and became man. 8. Because of this, Jesus Christ now possesses both his divine nature and our human nature. He is consubstantial with the Father and the Holy Spirit on account of the first, and consubstantial with us on account of the second. Everything it means to be a human being, Christ became. Responding to the early Christological controversies, the Fathers insist Christ took on both a human body and a human soul with the energy and will proper to it. For if he took on one without the other, or all of one and only part of the other, as Apollinaris claimed, then the entire man, the whole of the human being, would not be saved. In the words of St. Gregory, the theologian, that which is not assumed is not saved or healed. 9. The idea of a gendered or sexually differentiated soul distorts our vision of salvation by distorting our understanding of the human being. If the souls of men and women differ by essence, then Christ only assumed a male human nature and a male soul along with it. This means the souls of women are not and cannot be saved. The view that only men are saved and women must become men in order to be saved does have a precedent in the firmly rejected apocryphal Gospel of Thomas. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mariam go out from among us, for women are not worthy of the life." Jesus said, "Look, I will lead her that I may make her male, in order that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven." Gospel of Thomas, saying 114. Interestingly, this apocryphal work is dated by some scholars around the same time as the rise of early proto-Kabbalistic traditions. Looking at whether post-temple Jewish mysticism may have influenced the writer of the Gospel of Thomas's soteriology alongside its relation to Apelles would make an interesting study. But the idea that women are not saved unless they become men is not an orthodox teaching. Christ assumed everything it means to be human. He assumed both essences of body and soul, which make up the single human nature. He became incarnate as a male and healed the one flesh that belongs to all humans. He took on a human soul, undifferentiated by essence in both men and women. And so, by his full assumption of what it means to be a human being, he saved both men and women. Christ destroyed death by death, transforming this tragedy into a mercy. For just as sin is the beginning of death, death is the end of sin. But in Christ there is life. For Christ himself, as perfect man and perfect God, bridges the gap between the uncreated and the created chasm between the intelligible and the sensible, and the unnatural division between the living and the departed. All of these he perfectly unites in his divine person. In this sense, all is reunited in him because all exist in him, and in him there are no divisions. He is the man par excellence who takes up all of creation in himself and offers it to the Father on the cross. Even though many of the Church Fathers who witnessed to the sexlessness of the soul lived over 1,000 years before the advent of gender theory, their consensus preemptively refutes the idea that gender can be severed from biological sex. This can provide us with inspiration for how to speak about the issues facing the Orthodox Church in the world today. The simple fact is that there is not and cannot be a distinction between male and female souls. There is no place for sexual differentiation in the soul. A male human being may be more emotional by disposition and a female more courageous without either sacrificing maleness or femaleness. Whether or not they conform to the typical patterns of behavior assigned to their biological sex, they still are, in fact, what their biological sex at birth proclaims. Medical science stands on the side of the fathers. The castrated male is still male. After all, biological sex is more than genitalia, and it is not changeable. Even though the push for social approval and lawful recognition of transgender and genderqueer individuals is rapidly gaining momentum today, there are differences in certain foundational principles. Some transgender advocates claim a male can have a female soul or female brain, or vice versa. This emphasis on the distinction between one's true inner self over against their outward biology is the argument pushed within popular culture through the media. A turning point in the public perception of this was marked by the 2015 interview between Bruce Jenner and Diane Sawyer, in which Jenner tearfully admitted to suffering from gender dysphoria, a painful disparity between his perceived internal gender and outer biological sex. This was a catalyst for the societal push for nationwide legalization and acceptance of gender reassignment surgeries. Today, it is argued that these surgeries should even be available to young children, so that all have the freedom to conform their external body to match their true internal self. This form of gender rhetoric tends to stay within the gender binary of male-female and reaffirm cultural expressions of manhood and womanhood. For example, a male with a female gender identity would wear dresses, high heels, makeup, etc. On the other hand, some claim that all gender is performative. People discover and solidify their gender by their performance of it in day-to-day life. In this view, gender is said to be fluid. Gender fluidity means a person can drift in and out of gender identities based on desire or whim, though it may not be expressed thus. According to this philosophy, there are an infinite number of sexes and gender identities. It is not necessary to surgically conform the outer body to one's internal identity because gender identity is not fixed. This understanding of gender prevails in the academic world, which has been led for the last few decades by Judith Butler. Butler criticizes the linguistic bifurcation of sex and gender. Instead, she theorizes that gender is constructed over time and eventually comes to be normalized within society. This normalization is then reflected in our physical embodiment. Human bodies and sexuality change with this normative consensus. She concludes that gender is fluid. What has been observed as a male-female binary in our own day is nothing more than the reiteration of gender roles within the culture over time. Hence, the binary is not binding, it is indicative of our culturally biased expression of it. In this sense, we might make a peculiar equation between Butler's theory of gender performance and cultural reiteration, which eventually results in this culturally confirmed gender pressing itself upon the body, with Apelles' view of the soul pressing its sex upon the body. While neither admit a distinction between internal gender and biological sex, both believe that the physical manifestation of sex is affected or developed by some other internal force or reality. The difference in Butler's view is her aberration from the binary alongside her emphasis on the necessity of cultural confirmation. Regardless of which modern theory of gender one prefers, both fall into a series of ancient philosophical errors from dualism to materialism. Inasmuch as the line between these two streams of thought is blurred by the media, most individuals wind up expressing aspects of each. The result is an ever-evolving host of philosophies which, on account of their unremitting variations, are impossible to adequately refute. What prevails within society as a whole, then, is their common vision: to acquire freedom for individuals to act or do anything they want, with the added bonus of legally mandated punitive action against those who disagree with their actions or ideologies. Within the Christian understanding of freedom, however, these are passionately fighting for slavery. True freedom is the ability to restrain the desires of the flesh and the clarity to recognize that some of our desires are misplaced. The inability, or at the very least the refusal, to do this is slavery. This shared vision is expressed with a common vernacular that has developed over the last several years. Sex and gender is said to be a triadic relationship between one's body, internal identity, and expression of sex/gender. This triad is distinct from sexual orientation. One can be a biological male who identifies as a female, expresses his identity in a culturally accepted feminine way, but still have a heterosexual orientation. Thus, in modern rhetoric, there is biological sex, sex of the body, internal gender identity, perceived internal identity, and expression of gender, how one acts, dresses, etc. The two streams of thought outlined above mainly disagree as to whether or not internal gender identity is fixed. The first group would say it is, while the second group would say it can fluctuate, along with sexual orientation or preference. Modern concepts. Concerning biological sex, gender theorists tend to fight against the gender binary, a concept wherein most societies view sex as a binary concept, with two rigidly fixed options, male or female. But there are naturally occurring intersex conditions that demonstrate that sex exists across a continuum of possibilities. It is claimed that the infinite variation within the female and male bodies, alongside conditions wherein a child is born with a variation of, or even both, reproductive organs, demonstrates that there is a biological spectrum which itself should be enough to dispel the simplistic notion of the gender binary. There are not just two sexes. 16. So, dividing mankind into male and female categories based on biology is invalid, because there are countless biological variations. It should be obvious that this view is dedicated to an evolutionary anthropology wherein there is not a prototypical man, a creation of male and female, but rather countless variations of apes, ape men, and men. The method proposed by gender theorists seems to indicate that any variation is individualization, in the sense that there is no ontological grounding for man. There is no such thing as a human being, but only individuals. Individual biological variations necessarily set each individual in a category by himself, so that there are an infinite number of possible biological sexes and genders. Unsurprisingly, it is only the non-conforming sex and gender variations which are highlighted within this opinion. Conditions such as autism, Down syndrome, and various mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, or even in the existence of extraphalanges, missing organs, or vestigial tails, are all considered outside of the normal human condition. Horrifyingly, the discovery of Down syndrome in a child in utero today, in an increasing number of cases, leads to abortion. This shows a clear double standard. We need not point out in detail that placing such conditions outside the normal is inconsistent if there is no normal, if everything is reckoned on the basis of the individual. It is rarely mentioned that in most intersex cases there is one set of fully developed organs, while the other is an additional, underdeveloped part. Neither is it mentioned that when biologically tested, the results demonstrate a clear consensus of male or female, usually in concert with the developed organs. While the anomaly of intersex conditions is said to prove the existence of sex outside of the binary, this raises a number of questions, such as why the physiological variation is not more than it is, not just in percentage of intersex, but in actual variation. Intersexuality and hormonal and chromosomal variations. Biological sex is written into every cell of the human body. The script which determines one's biological sex is the 23rd pair of chromosomes. Female human beings have 2 X chromosomes and males have 1 X and 1 Y. There are, however, an array of chromosomal variations wherein a child may be born with 47 total chromosomes. XXY, called Klinefelter's syndrome, my X, called triple X syndrome, or XYY, and others that result in only 1 X or Y. When a male child is born with XXY chromosomes, affecting 1 out of every 600 males, his testosterone levels, organ size, body shape, hair growth, and fertility will be affected. With triple X syndrome, 1 in 1,000, there are few physical affectations, though a female who has 3 X chromosomes may be taller than average. Other variations include monosomy, where only one sex chromosome is present, totaling 45 chromosomes instead of 46. Only one X chromosome, occurring at a rate of 1 in 1,000, is called Turner's syndrome and may cause short stature or lessen feminine features. Other rare variations, which we will not detail here, have also been observed. Intersexuality is a biological irregularity that presents a host of difficulties. According to the World Health Organization, an estimate about the birth prevalence of intersex is difficult to make because there are no concrete parameters to the definition of intersex. While visible intersexuality is somewhat rare, 0.05% of births, most of the discourse which highlights intersexuality as a proof that biological sex is not stable lumps all of these anomalies together under the label of intersexuality in order to get a higher percentage of those affected. Planned Parenthood places the frequency of such cases as 1 in 100 or 1% of all births. With all of these cases, however, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. Indeed, we must demur in the rarest instances when the biological sex of an infant with 2 sets of fully developed sexual organs is determined by surgeons, but the child later expresses serious gender dysphoria. Along this line, we might raise an interesting, albeit possibly absurd, question. If we, as Orthodox Christians, who have a long tradition of condemning unnecessary, the operative word, removal of body parts, how should we view such surgical interventions? Rare as they are, how should the biological sex of such a child be determined? Such cases present serious pastoral considerations. While such variations are often held up in favor of transgenderism against proponents of the male-female binary, there have yet to be any studies linking specific cases of chromosomal variations or intersex conditions with the development of gender dysphoria or transgenderism. Certainly, such cases present difficulties for the lives of those they affect, who must come to terms, emotionally and psychologically, with physical aberrations from most of their peers. Such struggles should not be dismissed, as they present a situation where pastoral care should also be exercised carefully. Gender and expression. While we have already spoken of the binary in several instances, it is important to note that occasionally a distinction is made between the biological binary and gender binary. Typically, the titles male and female are used for biology, and man and woman are used for what might be called the social construction of the gender binary. The latter is our internal experience and naming of our gender. 19. Because naming our gender can be a complex and evolving matter, we are provided with limited language for gender. It may take a person quite some time to discover or create the language that best communicates their gender. Theoretically, this means there could be as many genders as people in the world, or even more if gender varies day by day. In this sense, gender is ceaselessly created or constructed, and in a sense can never be repeated because it is an individual experience. The rhetoric certainly seems to indicate conclusions like this, but Butler gets around such critiques by using Derrida's idea of iterability and aspects of Foucault's understanding of discipline, claiming that acts performed by many individuals construct such variations. With this understanding of gender, a number of new terms have arisen, such as cisgender, a person who has a gender identity consistent with the sex they were assigned at birth. By contrast, a transgender person has a gender identity that does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. This typically involves a male identifying as a female, or vice versa. In other words, it still involves the male-female binary. But there are also gender identities which are non-binary, where someone does not identify as a boy or a girl, but as both or neither, or as another gender entirely. Those who do not claim any gender, binary or non-binary, are called agender. Modern concepts. Concerning gender expression, gender is written into the fabric of society itself. Practically everything is assigned a gender. Toys, colors, clothes, and activities are some of the more obvious examples. Gender expression, then, is the way we show our gender to the world around us, through such things as clothing, hairstyles, and mannerisms, to name a few. However, it is important to keep in mind that gender expression is distinct from identity. We can't assume a person's gender identity based on their gender expression. For example, a cisgender boy may like to wear skirts or dresses. His choice in clothing doesn't change his gender identity. It simply means that he prefers, at least some of the time, to wear clothing that society typically associates with girls. This means that just as there are an infinite number of sexes and genders, there are an infinite number of ways to express gender. It is the unique right of the individual to construct not only his own gender, but his own expression of gender, and to display his self-created gender to the world. In this, we can discern just another example of what I call academic morphology. This self-construction of gender is nothing more than an appropriation of existentialist philosophy applied to gender. A bastardization of Sartre's existence precedes essence. Within our present society, one is acting in bad faith if they are not being true to themselves, and to be true to yourself is to claim any feeling or desire as identity and fact, then assert the will in defense of these self-created identities. Author's note on the term academic morphology. I would like to connect this term to the idea that every culture inherits a series of culturally accepted truths which are then reseeded, watered, and flower into new truths. Consider the following: the deification of the rational mind, Dioneia, in the West, beginning with Anselm of Canterbury and flowering with Thomas Aquinas, allowed for the development of the radical individualism of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. This individualism was then inherited by the society at large, which began tearing down traditional society symbolically with anti-traditional developments in art, music, and architecture, see Picasso, Wagner, and Gropius, marshalling this individualism and sexual libertinism. These indirect attacks on Christianity, in turn, led man to the dialectical consummation of individualism in the philosophy of existentialism, modern man's blatant codification and deification of the prior 300 years' work. This synthesis of indirect and direct attacks on tradition fed the monster of zeitgeist. By the 21st century, this philosophical synthesis trickled down into the common vernacular and was accepted by modern man as the cultural truth. Thus, as Sartre says, man does not have an essence and therefore must create himself. Our society believes there are no governing restrictions on what man can create himself to be. As de Beauvoir says that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Our society believes the distinction between male and female does not even exist, but only pieces of their philosophy are taken, resulting in a bastardization of their larger point. Thus, the apex of a cultural movement is prefigured by the indirect proffering of these ideas, followed by their codification in intellectual formulation, only to become for the next century a trite pool quote that trivializes the philosophy in order to make it comprehensible for the masses and to push a different agenda. When it is fully digested, it becomes an inherent cultural truth about which no questions are raised. And the previous century's intellectual elite, who did much work to establish this truth, become another vague memory, a nostalgia, to which the pop culture is incontestably indebted, but of whom they have no memory. Consider Charles Taylor's social contagion. Sexual orientation. Homosexuality as a sexual orientation is distinct from the topic of transgenderism in that one's sexual preferences are not a direct result of the complex interrelationship between the triad of body, identity, and expression. For this reason, how we approach transgenderism will not be the most effective approach to homosexuality. In the homosexual debate, identity is simply equated with sexual orientation, which exists from birth and is fixed. In the transgender debate, identity is self-created. Sexual orientation stands apart from this identity in most cases. In some circles, sexual orientation is considered fixed, and in others it is said to fluctuate from day to day as mere sexual preference or whim and desire. But the locus of identity for the transgender community is in this self-asserted gender. Gender rhetoric and the Orthodox Church. The main issue with gender rhetoric is that it rapidly morphs over short periods of time. It is easy to get stuck in trying to figure out the terminology or get roped into using it. When this happens, our conclusions depart from Orthodox tradition, as the language itself assumes an anthropology that is not orthodox. Given what we know about the human soul through divine revelation, that it is sexless, has a specific ordering wherein the intelligent aspect leads the lower aspects, and that it has a noetic window through which divine realities are directly perceived, we cannot accept the first premise assumed in the separation of biological sex from gender. Considering that this distinction is the foundation upon which these elaborate theories of gender are built, the Father's teaching that sex belongs to the body and is absent from the inner man is crucial in our response as Orthodox Christians. Unfortunately, some Orthodox academics have already bought into this deceptive distinction, calling for an Orthodox response to, and in some cases, even Orthodox approval of, transgender lifestyles. Granted, even questioning this distinction between sex/gender is likely to do damage to one's academic reputation. Even speaking about the subject has become dangerous, socially and sometimes physically. The world is trying to force us into linguistic traps. The militant campaign, under the name of human rights, is trying to bully us into using the pronouns preferred by each individual. But Orthodox Christians in the 21st century would do well to take up their cross in opposing this modern Caesar and, if necessary, face the wild animals in the Colosseum. We are not in the business of reinforcing lies that prevent the freedom of the human being. Our goal is to proclaim true freedom in Christ. For this is true freedom, freedom from the passions and from necessity, the healing of the entire human person. Maintaining the truth consists in our ability to hold together two paradoxical realities, that the body and the soul are distinct from one another but cohere, and that they are both important. If we fail to adequately distinguish between the body and the soul, we become materialists. If we fail to properly affirm the unity of the soul and the body, we become Neoplatonists. Just as confessing the truth about the God-man requires us to crucify our minds, holding together any two paradoxical realities required by the truth necessitates that we mount the cross with our arms outstretched. This is the Christian embrace of the transgender community. What many of those within the transgender movement find impossible to understand is that we profess what we do because it is the path to healing. We do not want them to suffer or to feel lonely, confused, or depressed. But in their narrative, those who do not automatically approve of their lifestyle hate them. They are bigoted because they refuse their fundamental human right to act or dress a certain way, to do what they please with their body. They are right in one sense. It is their choice. They have the fundamental human right, a God-given right to choose, which we affirm. What we deny is that all choices are neutral. Every choice we make moves us further toward or away from healing. The way C.S. Lewis describes this reality in Mere Christianity is worth quoting at length. Every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or a hellish creature, either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. Every choice we make takes us one step down the road. Every choice provides us an opportunity to be deified or damned. As Orthodox Christians, we cannot fall into confusion or timidity about which choices lead to life and which choices lead to death. Thank you for listening to this Theoria TV production of On Gender and the Soul. You can purchase a physical copy of the book, which includes detailed citations and key quotes in the original Greek and Latin, by searching On Gender and the Soul on Amazon.com. If you appreciate our work to provide professional quality Orthodox audiobooks free of charge, please consider supporting our work by joining as a member on patreon.com/TheoriaTV or by becoming a member on YouTube.